Our final speaker in this panel is Dr. Kevin Riley, Director of Research and Evaluation at the UCLA Labor, Occupational Safety and Health Program. Kevin.
Thanks very much, Bob. 1 second, let me get my slides up here. All right, thank you very much. Thanks everyone for having me, and good morning. My comments, I think, are going to be a kind of a nice complement to what Joe just talked about. And I'm going to continue the theme of wildfires, but look at a couple of non-traditional workforces here that we don't necessarily think of as being particularly impacted by these events. So that is, I want to talk about agricultural workers, and I'm also going to talk about residential day laborers. I'll just say by way of introduction, so our program at UCLA is an outreach program that's part of the university. We're affiliated with the School of Public Health. We do a lot of training, technical assistance, other sources of support for workers across a lot of different industries around health and safety issues. And we've been getting more and more requests and questions about respiratory protection issues in the last several years, in large part because of the wildfire issue, which is becoming more and more severe here in California. Obviously, more recently, we've been getting a lot related to coronavirus as well. But for the purposes of this morning, I'm going to talk a little bit about the wildfire piece. So starting off with agricultural workers. So there have been more and more concerns about workers in agriculture here in California, particularly with some of the really intense wildfires we've had over the last several years. The concerns here are less about workers that are in the direct line of the fire itself, but more about those who are exposed to smoke and ash and poor air quality, especially when workers are expected to continue harvesting despite the deterioration in air quality as a result of these fires. It's gotten a lot of media attention, the concerns around ag workers in particular. And so much so that actually last year, July 2019, our state OSHA program enacted a new temporary standard, emergency standard related to wildfire smoke. The standard itself extends beyond agriculture workers. It's not the only workforce it protects, but it's basically designed to provide protections to any workers who may be out and impacted by air quality issues related to nearby wildland fires. The focus of this standard is particularly around PM 2.5. And you can see here, I just included, for those who may be interested, some of the employer requirements that are built into this standard. So it includes things like employers having to monitor AQI, to train and communicate with workers about air quality issues, and to reduce workers' exposures to PM 2.5 through a variety of means. Involves engineering controls and modified work practices. But related to this discussion today, it does include some language around respiratory protection as well. So the way our standard has been written, basically what it requires is that if the AQI for PM 2.5 reaches 151, employers are expected to allow for voluntary respiratory protection for workers. And in that case, obviously, employers have to follow sort of OSHA guidelines and providing information to workers. If the AQI exceeds 500 and an employer expects workers to continue to work in those conditions, then there's mandatory respiratory protection is implemented. And in that case, there has to be a respiratory protection program, and all applicable OSHA standards need to be followed. Now, for a sector like agriculture, it's sort of a particularly interesting standard here because, as with some of these other sectors, this is not necessarily an industry where respiratory protection is widespread. These are not employers that typically have respiratory protection programs. So in a lot of ways, we're very much back at square one and sort of thinking about how will this standard how will this actually be implemented and enacted? We've only had it on the books now for a little over a year, so it hasn't really had much chance to be tested yet. But I'll say a little bit more in a few minutes. Our program has done some work around education and support to try and make sure that workers and employers understand what the requirements are for this standard, particularly in the agricultural sector, and to make sure that as subsequent wildfires come up, that there are adequate protections in place for these workers. So I'll come back to the agricultural workers in a second. I want to just shift to the second group for a few minutes. So I think kind of maybe at the far end of this non-traditional scale is I want to raise the issue here of day laborers and domestic workers. This is probably a group that doesn't immediately come to mind when you think about the need for respiratory protection. But here again, as the wildfires here in California have gotten more intense, there's been more and more concerns among this largely informal worker population and the potential exposures they have. And there's kind of a confluence of issues here, one of which is that you've got residential areas that are more and more being developed right on the boundary of where the wildfires are prone to happen. And often those developments are also more wealthy communities. So those are homes that are hiring help to come in and care for their property, care for families. And so in the last several years, we've heard more and more accounts as some of these large fires have erupted of workers on the properties who are expected to carry out some pretty intense work and putting themselves at pretty high risk. And what I want to do here is share a short video clip that I think illustrates well what I'm talking about. So this was a video from about a year ago. This was a fire that happened in Pacific Palisades, which is a relatively wealthy community here in Los Angeles. And as I click play here, you can sort of see this was footage captured by a news helicopter. And as you zoom in here, you see fire obviously in the background in that camera. And you can see on the ridge, there's a group of workers there that sort of be kind of holding down that fire. There's a fire helicopter that just passed above. But those folks, they're presumably kind of working on that property. As you zoom out, we're going to zoom over to the left. There's going to be another group of two. There's another group right there. Presumably those folks were, maybe they were doing some of the construction work on that structure in the foreground. But as the fire came up, you've now got several of them that are there right on the edge, holding down the flames. Now, we don't know exactly what's happening here, but my guess is these were probably day laborers or other informal kinds of workers on the property. As the fire erupted, someone, a supervisor, someone probably told them to bring out the hoses and start hosing down the hillside. But clearly, this is a risky situation, and you can sort of see that smoke and ash filling up. So we're coming back to the other floor to the top. And, that's a pretty nice property there. You can see a swimming pool and everything. So this is just kind of captured by chance by a newscaster, but I think for us it really struck a chord because these are not kinds of work pictures that we typically not really see, but this is sort of a unique chance to see the
Yeah, county fire's coming in from the left. County fire's coming in from the left. Quick. Coming in hot.
So back to my slides. So obviously, responding to fires that may pop up is one issue that these day laborers are likely to face. The other stories we hear quite a bit of are day laborers who are called into these wildfire impacted areas, these residential areas, very quickly after the fires subside for cleanup work. Whether it's properties that have been fully destroyed or even properties where there may just be sort of layers of soot and ash left behind. There's more and more workers are kind of being called in to do that work, obviously raising a lot of other concerns, additional concerns around the need for respiratory protection from those fine particles. And this, given the informal nature of this work, we're clearly now talking about work arrangements where there's just no formal respiratory protection programs in place. So this is sort of an issue we're really trying to grapple with and figure out what to do about. So just a couple, reflections to start us off, and we can talk more in our discussion. Given that our program is very much embedded in education work, I think the first thing that comes to all of our minds is sort of the critical need for education, both for workers and for employers. And so we've done this in different kinds of ways. I mentioned in the context of ag workers, we've been doing more training related to the wildfire standard that's here in place in the state. You can see these were some materials that were developed by colleagues of ours at UC Davis. But we've been using these to roll out some trainings to ag workers in our region as well. Obviously the training here, education needs to focus on a whole range of issues that, the kinds of respiratory hazards workers may face, the types of protection, how to wear an N95, how to test it. It's really important that these materials be accessible to these audiences. These are audiences that They're largely not English speaking. Often they're not even Spanish speaking. Folks speak indigenous languages. So we've developed some mechanisms for reaching them as well. And then I'll show you, there's some photos here of some training we've done with day laborers. Here again, kind of using an N95, how to don and doff N95s, how to test them out. One of the striking things we see a lot of here, and something we're really trying to figure out how to grapple with, is that there's a lot of education required also in terms of what an N95 is good to protect you against and what it's not. So we find a lot of these workers, for example, ag workers, using N95s to protect against pesticides, or in the case of day laborers and domestic workers, folks using them if they're handling, paint fumes or toxic chemicals. So that's been an area we've really had to delve into with folks to help them understand that, a mask is not a mask, that an N95 is going to protect you from certain kinds of exposures, but not others. And then sort of also making sure that people understand that there's both the kind of acute hazards or acute impacts that arise from exposure to these hazards, but also there's potential long-term impacts as well, and sort of really helping people to think that through. So that's one issue. Certainly, I think we see a lot of concerns around the intersection of respiratory protection issues with sort of other factors. So you've got sort of the environmental hazards, heat that Joe had described. In agriculture in particular, there's always these challenges related to the incentive structures that are driving the pace of work. So as people are paid by piece rate, what that is ultimately doing is sort of undermining people's incentives for wanting to, say, step away if they're getting overheated, or to even slow down if they're wearing a respirator and there's additional burden, physical burden on their body. And then in the case of the day laborers, those temporary and informal employment relationships really create challenges in figuring out how to ensure that people have the kind of protections they need. They're not being put at additional risk by using some sort of respiratory protection. One thing I would sort of encourage all of us to be thinking about, and this approach we use quite a bit, is sort of partnerships and engagement with worker and community organizations. So, these are not traditional work settings necessarily, not ones where we have kind of a traditional employment relationship, but there are a lot of very good organizations on the ground that are reaching these workforces, that are engaging with them in ways that are effective. So for us, being able to roll out education and support in partnership with those organizations has been really key. And we can talk a little bit more about that. And then lastly, I'll just say, for us here in California, watching this, the wildfire smoke standard unfold, I think in a way it's kind of an interesting natural experiment. And I'm sort of listening to some of the presenters earlier about what things look like 50 years ago. I think in a lot of these sectors where the standard now applies, we're back to square one. And I think there's a real critical need to kind of watch how the standard unfolds, sort of evaluate its implementation, particularly for these kinds of workforces where it's sort of a lot of sort of difficult issues, I would say, to making sure that the protections are implemented properly. So I will leave it at that, and I will stop sharing my slides. So thanks.